WA State Director Peter Abetz, welcome to Voice for Values. It's a great joy to have you on today.
Good to be with you, Carlos.
Peter, firstly, as we begin today's conversation, want to throw to you as the person, the man, the story behind Peter Abetz. I know that you've had quite an extensive career both in agriculture, also in Christian ministry and politics. Peter, I want to throw to you. Can you tell us about who you are and your history, please?
Yeah, look, I grew up in Tasmania. My parents were Christians, so I had the privilege of growing up in a Christian home. I always wanted to be a farmer, but mum and dad were migrants, didn't have much money, so I figured that would never happen. So I went to university and did an agricultural science degree and worked as a farm advisory officer for about 4 years, and then for 2 years rather than for 4 years in the private sector. It was through that work that I realised that I'm very much a people person. And as young as I was, a lot of the farming community shared their family concerns with me, even though I was there more on a technical basis. And eventually I went off to theological college and studied for ministry, and then served as a pastor in the Christian Reformed churches for 25 years. And towards the end of that time, I got really concerned about what was happening politically in terms of the undermining of our Christian values in society, and particularly in Parliament with the laws that were going through. And that prompted me to pray that God would raise up godly men and women for the corridors of power. And I prayed that too many times in the worship service, and some of the elders after a while suggested that I might be the answer to my own prayer and suggested I should have a go at running for Parliament. And I was very reluctant about that because I really loved ministry. But eventually, cut a very long story short, I joined the Liberal Party back in 2004 and helped one of the candidates with their campaign just to see how it all works. And then in 2008, I nominated for the seat of Southern River, and as God would have it, I won that seat just by 686 votes. And that led to 2 terms in the Parliament. That's 8 and a little bit years. And I retained that seat for those 2 terms, and lost my seat at the last election, 2017. And then sometime later, the ACL contacted me and asked me whether I would consider taking on the role of State Director for Western Australia. I had run the No campaign for the Coalition for Marriage in Western Australia. So I had some involvement there. And yeah, I guess that's very briefly my story. I'm married to Jenny. We've got 5 children. They're all married, and we have 11 grandchildren.
Wow, 11. Wow. They keep you busy, huh?
Yeah. Sadly, there's none living in Perth of the grandchildren. They spread far and wide.
Right, I see. Peter, many people maybe in society reflect on the fact that Christianity or religion and politics shouldn't really mix. You're somebody that's had a background both in Christian ministry and politics. What are your thoughts around the mixture between religion and politics?
Look, I know it's a very popular thing to say religion and politics don't mix, but that's actually a fallacy, because my view is that every human being has a world and life view. Everybody looks at the world, looks at reality through a particular grid, and that shapes the way we see things. And you know, an ardent environmentalist may see their worldview may be shaped very much by sort of a semi-worship of nature, for example. That colours their view. My view is coloured by the fact that I believe in the Bible as the Word of God, and therefore the values that puts before me, that shapes my view of the world. And democracy actually only works when all the different subgroups within society participate in the process of electing people, and it's then in the debates in Parliament that hopefully we can come up with with legislation that broadly most people can feel reasonably comfortable with. But if Christians don't engage in that process, then that's one perspective of society that gets left out. And given that roughly half of the population in Australia today still on the census identifies as Christian, it would be very wrong for the Christian community not to have a voice in politics.
Yeah, thanks for giving us the insight, and yeah, you've raised some very good points about the necessity really for faith-based people to have a view, to have a voice, to have a say around certain issues, particularly in politics. Now, leads me to wanting to ask you about the work that you and the team in WA are doing. Can you give us an overview, perhaps, for us around the nation, really, about what you are doing in WA?
Well, in Western Australia, we've got two significant issues happening at this time. One is a bill to amend the Human Reproductive Technology and Surrogacy Acts, and that there's an amendment bill going through. And basically what that seeks to do is to give single men the right to surrogacy and also to same-sex couples access to surrogacy. Surrogacy legislation went through in Western Australia in 2008, and it limited surrogacy to couples. And there was a loophole in it which somehow allowed single females to have access to it, which was actually not the intention of the legislation. I was in Parliament at the time, and the fact that lawyers could read that into it baffled me. But anyway, that's I'm not a legal person, so that on the basis of that, the McGowan Labor government said, well, we need to fix that, because you can't discriminate. If you allow single females to have access to surrogacy, you'd also need to allow males to have access to surrogacy. But interestingly, since the law had come in, no female had actually applied for surrogacy.
So Peter, right now, so under current laws, women, single females can be surrogates. Is that right? And so now the legislative changes are seeking to kind of bring parity towards others to have the same rights. Is that the way to understand it?
It's not so much about single women being able to be surrogates, but to actually to access surrogacy. So if a single woman for some reason can't have a child for medical reasons, she can actually commission another woman to have a child for her, even though she is single and is not in a relationship with anyone else. And likewise for men, and that is something that is of significant concern. And unfortunately, the bill has gone through the lower house, and in the coming weeks, it will be debated in the upper house. The government claims that they have to give everyone access to surrogacy, irrespective of their relationship status and sex, because the Federal Anti-Discrimination Act does not allow for that kind of discrimination. But I think given the children are involved, I think the government could actually ask the federal government to modify their legislation to actually allow for the discrimination that surrogacy would not be available to single people. So that's one issue, because the research is very clear that the children do best on a whole range of parameters if they're brought up by their biological married mum and dad, next by their biological de facto relationship parents, and so on. And single parenting, a lot of single parents do a fantastic job bringing up their children. There's no question about that. But I think most single parents would acknowledge that it's a tough gig, and to deliberately create a child, to put it into a situation where it will not know its father or mother, is something that I believe is clearly wrong.
And very likely to be damaging to children into their future, right?
Well, I mean, the results of there are some studies that have been published which claim that there is no difference in the results for children raised by single parents or same-sex parents, but they're very small studies, and when you have a small sample, you need huge differences to be able to pick up statistically significant difference, and often these studies are also done where the parents or the parent is actually asked what they think their child is experiencing and so on, whereas the two big studies that have been done that track people through and talks to people who are now in their 30s and 40s who were brought up in different scenarios, that's where you have you can actually pick up very significant differences, and so that's an area of real concern.
Peter, there's also another significant issue that's been lobbied against in WA at the moment, and that is around euthanasia. Can you give us an update on that?
Yeah, the End of Life Choices Joint Parliamentary Committee handed down its report some weeks ago, and that report was put into the Parliament, but one of the members of the committee, the Honourable Nick Goyron, did a minority report, which is almost as big as the committee's report. It's an outstanding piece of work, the minority report, because the committee did not actually look at what happens in other jurisdictions where they've had euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide laws in place for any period of time, and so they've ignored that. And when you actually look at what's happening in Oregon, in the Netherlands, Belgium, and so on, when you become aware of that, you've become aware very much that it's simply impossible to put sufficient safeguards around the legislation to keep the original intent of the legislation intact. And I think the British Parliament had a committee that recommended against going down the path of euthanasia because they said it's simply legally impossible to provide sufficient protections. And here in Western Australia, if the recommendations of the committee are implemented, we would probably have the very, very open legislation, and that is of great concern. So we're working hard at getting alongside of MPs, making them aware of what's happened in other places, so that they can actually see and understand what goes on, and hopefully oppose the legislation when that eventually comes into Parliament. We don't expect to see any legislation coming into Parliament before early next year.
Okay. So, Peter, it was roughly about 7 weeks ago that that euthanasia was debated here in Canberra, up in Parliament House. I absolutely understand that there are differences in both bills that are being proposed, that were proposed both nationally as well as in WA. I understand that, but the significance of the fact that such an issue was debated in Parliament and that it was voted down to allow for the Northern Territory and the ACT to self-govern and to self-regulate on the issue of euthanasia. Does that have any effect? Does that impact anything at all? Does that affect members in Parliament in WA at all?
Look, I don't think that'll have a significant impact on the way that members of Parliament here in Western Australia will vote. Both sides of politics will give their members a free vote on this subject, so it's up to each individual MP. Some may perhaps be influenced by that, but I think the big concern that we had with the Northern Territory legislation back in, I think, 1996 or whenever it was that was implemented was, I think there was 4 people that used that legislation to commit suicide, and 2 of them weren't even terminally ill, whereas the legislation actually required that. And that's the kind of problem that you have with the legislation, well, with any kind of physician-assisted suicide euthanasia legislation, is that if a person wants to commit suicide and the doctor helps, well, after the event, the person who's committed suicide is no longer there to give evidence. The doctor is allowed to keep silent, so it's almost impossible to actually enforce the legislation. And in the Netherlands, I think last year over 1,000 people were actually euthanized without having given their permission for it. So there's huge issues with this type of legislation. And I think the other thing that's really starting to resonate, and particularly in the Aboriginal community, is they've got such a high rate of suicide. A lot of the leaders are saying it's sending the wrong message, that under certain circumstances it's okay to commit suicide and even the doctor will help you to do it. So if it's okay in certain circumstances, if you're feeling really, really depressed and can't see a way forward, then, well, why shouldn't I commit suicide? So that's a real concern, that it's sending very mixed messages. On the one hand, government is spending big dollars on suicide prevention programs, but on the other hand, they're saying, hey, it's okay if you kind of think you've had enough. Under certain circumstances, it's okay to commit suicide, and that's an issue that really undermines the doctor-patient relationship. And the doctors here in Perth have indicated they really don't want to be involved in physician-assisted suicide, which is encouraging. But yeah, there's a whole lot of issues around this legislation, wherever it's been introduced, that it creates, there's very much a slippery slope, and people say, oh, that's just a slippery slope argument, but it's documented, it's there. And the other thing is the people who promote it are saying, because nobody should die in agony, but the reality is that palliative care in Western Australia really needs a lot more funding, because in regional areas it's simply not accessible. There's very limited palliative care available, and rather than spend money on developing physician-assisted suicide, let's give people the best possible palliative care. And as we've learned from the Oregon situation in the United States, where they've had physician-assisted suicide for 20 years now, I think it's only 23% of people mention pain as one of the reasons that they want to access euthanasia. The biggest, over 70%, say it's because I'm being a burden to those around me. And I think if that's the reason people choose physician-assisted suicide, that's really a very sad situation. And the other thing is, it really puts pressure on people, because if I'm dying of some condition and I can see I'm being a burden to my family, then because physician-assisted suicide is an option, it actually puts a subtle pressure on me to access that, even though I might not really want to. I'm still quite comfortable, but yeah, the pressure is there. And so there's a whole lot of issues that we're trying to get across to MPs, that this is not good legislation. It's not a good way to go.
So Peter, when you speak to MPs in WA, can you give us an insight really as to those conversations? What are they both when we're talking about the surrogacy issue that you spoke about before, and the euthanasia issue? When you are speaking to MPs about these two issues, what are their reflections? What are they responding to? Are they responding to the emotional side of both arguments? Are they responding to facts? I would love to just get an insight from you as to what it is that is helping MPs to make decisions on these two issues.
Look, I think there is a certain subset of MPs that absolutely made up their mind that they're going to support euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide, and we're not going to budge them from the position that they hold. But there is a large number who are very thoughtful, and they've heard some of the pros and cons and are trying to weigh them up, and being able to provide them with information and just get them to think through the issues is something that I'm very much engaged in, and they certainly appreciate that input. And at this point, because there's not even legislation before the Parliament, the committee recommended that the government appoint an expert panel to advise on how to draft this legislation. So that committee hasn't been appointed yet, and then the whole drafting process takes quite some time. So my guess is it probably won't be perhaps till April or so next year, at the earliest, that legislation would come before Parliament. So there's not the time pressure at the moment. So MPs are still quite willing to have a chat because there's no pressure yet. And so that's a good time, I think, for us to provide that input. And yeah, I'm finding quite an openness to hearing about the different issues, and yeah, they certainly seem to appreciate that.
So, Peter, what can people do? People that are passionate about perhaps euthanasia laws, people that are perhaps passionate about surrogacy laws. What can they be doing today in order to perhaps influence the way in which MPs will vote on these issues in the future?
Look, on the surrogacy issue, there's not a lot of time left. If they want to do something, to write a letter to their 6 upper house members, you can find who they are on the parliamentary website. Write them a letter expressing your opposition to allowing single people access to surrogacy. That certainly would be helpful. On the euthanasia side, even though there's no legislation before Parliament, it would be very helpful for people to keep writing letters to your MP expressing your opposition to euthanasia, and just give several of the reasons that you're opposed to it. Because MPs, it's bubbling in the background, this issue, and the so-called Dying with Dignity group, they're writing to their MPs saying, when it comes, make sure you support this legislation. So it's really important that those who are opposed to legislation, the euthanasia legislation, that they actually are also writing letters, because several MPs have told me that what they're going to do is they're going to keep track of how many pro letters and how many anti letters they're getting. And so it's important that our voice is heard. Don't assume that Joe Blow will write a letter. Make sure you write a letter to your state member of Parliament, and then when the legislation comes before Parliament next year, then we need to make another really concerted effort to highlight the deficiencies in the legislation and have a very focused campaign. But at the moment, just keep writing letters to your MPs.
Thanks for giving us that insight too. There's it's a significant time where people can be doing a lot, really, to raise their voice and to act and to let MPs know ahead of votes what they can be doing. Peter, with your extensive political background and your experience in politics, I want to ask you about the results. Just over the weekend, we saw a by-election in Wentworth, and we saw a significant result there. The Liberal Party lost. I heard over the weekend that it's the first time that the Liberal Party had not retained that seat since Federation. Can you give us your thoughts as to what happened over the weekend, and perhaps the overflow that will occur from that election?
Look, I think for the government, it was obviously a very negative thing to lose that seat, no question about that. The thing with a particular seat is that seats are never static. The demographics change, and the demographic of the seat of Wentworth is certainly very different to what it was 100 years ago. And so the dynamics of that seat have certainly changed. And I think the kind of values that Malcolm Turnbull espoused certainly resonated with a lot of the electorate in Wentworth. And so I think some of them were understandably very upset about the fact that Malcolm Turnbull had been dumped. But for example, in my area where I live here in Perth, there was just about jubilation at the fact that Malcolm Turnbull was now no longer the MP, the PM, and that we now had Scott Morrison, and there's a real sense of now we have some hope of winning seats here in Western Australia, or at least retaining seats. So it really depends on the demographic of who you're talking to, and obviously it's a disappointment to lose Wentworth, for any government to lose a by-election, and particularly now not to have control of the lower house, meaning that at least one of the crossbenchers will have to support legislation for it to get through the lower house. That will make it a little more difficult for the government, but hopefully there is enough wisdom in the crossbench that at least one of them will support most of the legislation. But with a little bit of negotiation, I don't see that as being all that difficult to do. When I got elected in 2008 here in the state parliament, it was a minority government that depended on the support of some of the independents to get legislation through, and that worked very, very well. It just meant the government did have to talk to the independents and make sure they did have their support before they introduced legislation into the parliament.
Thanks for your insights into that. From a perspective of the upcoming federal election at some point next year, you gave us a little bit of an insight perhaps as to what a change in leadership might do for WA. But I'm looking towards the future, keen to, as we begin to wrap up our conversation today, to really ask you your thoughts around what may happen at a national level when the federal election happens, and what, if any, will be the effects and the impacts to WA and to the work that ACL is doing currently in Parliament over there.
Look, I think the federal election is going to be a very interesting one, because sometimes people tune out. They've had enough, and then they've made up their mind. It doesn't matter what the other side does; they just don't hear that anymore. And I think for Scott Morrison, the challenge is to get people listening to what he is saying, and to be able to engage with people that it's seen as that he's seen as leading a credible government. And so I think that's one of the key things. And I think from the ACL's perspective, some of the material that is in the Australian Labor Party platform that they're going to presumably take to the next election, because in their draft platform, that should be of really grave concern, especially regarding the transgender issues that that they're trying to foist on the community if they win government. I think if we can get that message out to people, to those who are Labor supporters, to make sure that they try and get the Labor Party to change that. My view is that if the Labor Party pursues that line going through to the next into the next election, for people who share broadly Christian values, they'll have great difficulty in supporting Labor candidates. So I think there's a whole lot of issues going on there, and it's one of the questions whether people have tuned out so much because of all that's gone on in Canberra that they're not going to look at the issues anymore. They've just made up their mind and that's it. Then that would be very, very concerning. So I think ACL supporters have a big job ahead of them in not just lobbying MPs and writing their MPs, but actually talking to their friends and encouraging them to think through what the issues are, so they actually vote responsibly and make sure that they actually vote for the party that that has policies that are at least more in keeping with Christian values than the other. And I think that we need to look at that very, very carefully.
Yeah, very true, very true. It is time to have supporters around the country in WA really speaking to people really raising a voice for truth ahead of the upcoming elections. Peter, thank you so much for your time. It's been a great joy to get to know you as a man with so much experience and so much passion around Christianity and around politics. And thank you so much for also giving us a greater insight into surrogacy and what can be done there, as well as with euthanasia. And may God continue to bless you, continue to bless the work that you're doing and leading WA. And again, thank you for your time this morning.